Good evening. Welcome to session 3 of our study, Surprised by Hope. So great to be together and to be connected with one another, especially in the midst of all that we are experiencing as a community and as a nation and even as a world. So what a blessing, isn't it, to be able to have this technology that allows us to connect and have a sense of really being a part of something together. So really blessed by that, and just wanted to say that right off the bat. I know you're continuing to greet one another. That's one of the reasons that is there, that process of participating in the chat feature tonight. So go ahead and just keep saying hello to one another as we get started, and I want you to be able to feel free to use that in whatever way you'd like as we communicate and share and learn together. So as we know, this is session 3. We are focusing on the video segments, and there's a good one in store tonight. I think you're going to appreciate it, from N.T. Wright. I won't say a whole lot more about him except that he is still alive, first of all, so that's good to note that. He's a contemporary of ours, retired Bishop of the Church of England, more well known, I guess, in the last decade or so, by way of his teaching and his writing, and of course his video work. So that's the thing that brings us together, is the work that he's done around a book that he wrote, and then now this video series. The book, of course, is Surprised by Hope. Some of you have asked me about it. I know some of you have been able to secure it. Others of you, because of shipping problems, haven't received it. Let me just say again, only because I want to be so clear with all of you, that certainly get the book if you have interest. It goes much deeper than the videos, obviously. It's much more academic, and so in some ways it's a little challenging. But I think what you'll experience is that it it has a way of, I think, kind of deepening what it is that N.T. Wright is talking about. But I want to make the point again that you don't have to have the book to participate. So I know some of you have just been checking in on Wednesdays and sharing viewing the video and responding that way, and that's perfectly fine. But we are continuing on with what he has to tell us about resurrection, heaven, and then he's going to push that even further into what he thinks about is the mission of the church. Now, one of the reasons that I think this study is so meaningful to us is that he talks about the very season in which we are now celebrating, these days after Easter, when we are visiting both the stories in the gospel of the resurrected Jesus and the accounts of how the first believers began to gather together, and then out of that, the birth of the church. So that's the season of time in which we're focused as Christian people and as worshiping people. And here we are in this midday part of the week experience, thinking much more deeply about resurrection. And what N.T. Wright invites us to do is to ask the question, so what? In other words, what does the resurrection of Jesus Christ mean for me or for us or for our world, for the church? And that seems like a reasonable question, but I think the point is, I don't know that we think about that as intently and maybe with as much intention as we should. So for that reason, I think it's pretty cool that we're in the midst of this study right as we are sharing in our learning. So those are the things I wanted to say at the beginning. I know you've got some conversations going here. Hope everything's okay. It looks like most of those who are on are figuring things out, and that's just kind of where we are tonight. So I think we should probably get going because we've got lots of things to talk about, lots of things to lift up. I want to get to the material as quickly as we can. Let me share a prayer, and then we'll kind of pause with the texting for a minute, and then we'll get into some of our discussion and our learning. Let me invite you to join me as we pray together. Holy God, thank you, first of all, for one another. Thank you for the blessing that we're experiencing this evening by way of technology that connects us and truly helps us to experience what it means to be one in the Spirit. And so we receive that gift tonight and we participate in it, and we are grateful. We pray that you'll lead us in our discussion, in our shared learning. Help us to gain insight from this very gifted and fine thinker of the faith. And may the words that he lifts up encourage us to find in a deeper way what it means to live with your word planted within us. And it's in the name of Christ that we pray. Amen. All right. So, as I say, N.T. Wright moves us forward now in a deeper way in thinking about what and how resurrection, what it is, first of all, how it impacts with us and with our lives. And I wanted to lift up a summary statement. I think I pulled one of those out last week, and just find that to be helpful in setting a context that we can be thinking about together. So let me read the summary statement. Have you hear it, start to think with me about it. And this is a way of kind of capturing some of the essence of what N.T. Wright is writing about toward the middle part of his book, and of course what connects to the video clip that we'll see in just a moment. This is what I wanted to share. Again, from N.T. Wright. Heaven is not a faraway place we hope to go someday. Through Christ, it is very near. It is the control room of earth. And as we follow Jesus, the reality of heaven comes alive in us and is unleashed through us. I'll stop there because there's plenty there, isn't there? Let me read it again. I'll go a little more quickly, and just to kind of, again, allow this to be the context of what we're talking about and what we are discovering together. Heaven is not a faraway place we hope to go to someday. Through Christ, it is very near. It is the control room of earth, and as we follow Jesus, the reality of heaven comes alive in us and is unleashed through us. All right. So I want to know right away and get some feedback here by way of our beautiful chat window tonight. How you feel about the opening part of that statement, what you think about it, how it hits you. And that is the part there at the beginning where I read, heaven is not a faraway place, but through Christ is very near. How do you feel about that? What do you think about that? What's the reaction that gives you? Maybe it's emotional. Maybe it's some insight that comes to your mind, your thinking. Maybe it causes some wondering. Maybe it's confusing. Maybe it's a kind of thing that you've never thought about it before. But again, react to this. Heaven is not a faraway place, but through Christ it is very near. So Brenna's saying a very powerful statement, and I would agree with that. And I guess what we're after now is, what's the power in it? What are we hearing there? Kay says, reminds her of what Mary quoted last week about the kingdom of heaven being at hand. Okay, so something very near. Kelly says it's heartwarming. All right. Yeah, heaven is not a faraway place we want to get to someday, but within or through Christ, it's very near. Catherine says heaven is where I'm looking forward to being one day. So Catherine, that's, I think, how most of us and many of us think about it. And I think N.T. Wright is, pushing that a little bit to say, okay, what if it wasn't just some place we'll go to someday, but because of Christ is very, very near? And we're going to think and talk about that as the evening goes on. Karen says, likes the connection to God here on earth. Janine says it's reassuring and comforting, that statement is to her. And Drew says it's more, come to understand that the relationships are a centerpiece of faith. Realize that everything we're searching for is closer than we thought. So all of this struggle that we are in life and in faith, to find God, to be with God, to get to God, perhaps, Drew is saying, all of that is much more present, nearer to us, accessible than we ever thought that it was. Interesting. Brenna says it reminds me of a promise given, and perhaps even in some ways, I think we might discover as we move through our conversation tonight, a promise fulfilled. And maybe that's where part of the hope comes from. We'll see. Carol, welcome. Nice to have you with us tonight. My mother believed that and used to talk about it. She says of her mother and her mother's understanding of faith as she thought and talked about heaven. Carol says very much as if that presence was very near. Dave says makes heaven sound much more like the kingdom of God that Jesus is among us now. So bringing those two, let's call them theological or faith concepts together. And Catherine says, I always thought of heaven as a place where everything is wonderful. If heaven can be here on earth, she writes, then there's much work that we need to do. So let's hold that whole notion that if, and I know, it's fair enough to say if. And I think I said way back in our first session, we don't have to all agree on what we hear N.T. Wright saying to us. The hope is that it at least helps us to think, perhaps in some new ways, and potentially discover some new things. So it's not that we have to swallow this hook, line, and sinker, as one of my professors used to say, but it makes us think. And Catherine says, if what he's saying has some truth to it, then there's an impact that it makes upon us here. There's a reality to that we need to be aware of. Tim says, isn't there's heaven, there's that song, Heaven Came Down and Glory Filled My Soul. That whole notion of heaven coming down, keep your ears alert to that. And you're going to hear N.T. Wright speak to that, I think. Katya says, a very exciting and hopeful way of thinking, the possibilities. Perhaps there are no doors that can be opened, no situations that we can't overcome. It means that God's near and with us and through everything. So totally removing us from any thought of it's over, it's the end, it can't happen. All of the things that defeat us and push us down. Katya says, suddenly all of that feels and looks different because this could be true, might be true, is true. Mary says, Mary Ring, heaven is where God is, his kingdom, and his king and the kingdom, his kingdom is here. So where God is, that's it. And I think N.T. Wright would find some agreement with that. Catherine Perry says it was a new way of understanding this about 10 years ago. So Kathy says that she came to some thought about this not some time ago. And, it does kind of change everything, but it's something that you have to kind of live into and become more and more open to. And it does have a capacity, I think, to help us experience both God and life and faith in some different ways. That's the value of what we're doing here. Katya says, possibilities are infinite. I know, it's tough to talk and think and type, and believe me, I know. Tim's correcting his typing as well. So thank you for that. Hey, Tom, glad you're on. Glad you got onto the chat tonight. Tom Conrad's here with us tonight. And he says that heaven is a condition that with God's help, we create, participate in, are part of, experience, are in relationship with, all of those things. Thank you, Tom, for helping us kind of broaden that. Janine, I don't know if that's a smiley face or a sad face or a confused face, but I see your emoji there. Julie says it's our responsibility to making heaven happen on earth. So there's another comment there that we have some part to play in all of this. And that at least is some of the challenge that we are facing. So we want to keep thinking about that, what that may mean for us, and what the reality of that is for us. Carol says there is an old saying, heaven on earth. Yeah. And I think what N.T. Wright is focusing on here is the fact that so often in our faith, we think about it, talk about it, in quite different ways. As if heaven is that place far away someday. And again, the statement we're reflecting on is heaven is not a faraway place, but through Christ it is very near. Yeah. And so this notion then that we sometimes have, Janine says, don't worry, just got a new dog and he wanted to join me in the chair. And I think he typed that. Thank you for that, Janine. I read an article I think today I saw it, that in this experience we're going through, this pandemic, people are like seeking pets in just an incredible, to an incredible level. You probably have heard some of the reports that some of the shelters are completely empty of dogs because people are wanting something to focus on and hold and be close to. And so, Janine, you got a new dog, and that seems to fit with what a lot of folks are experiencing. So, but thank you for that clarification, where that face came from tonight. Yeah. So let me go back to the notes just so I can get myself back on track. I was thinking about these traditional ways that we often think of heaven. In fact, let's take a moment, just a minute or two here, to identify, again, the chat feature is so helpful to share in our response with one another. What are some of the traditional ways that we think about heaven, or the kind of descriptive terms that we use to talk about what heaven will be like? What are some of those ways? We're not going to cast any judgment one way or the other on that, but just simply, to remind ourselves kind of where we often are as we think about these things. And then, we'll see kind of where N.T. Wright wants to take us. So if you've got some responses to that, I want to catch Sandy's response from our last flow here. The quote really makes our lives here on earth even more important. Yeah. So let's shift, and Brenna's helping us do that right now. Pearly gates. Yeah, the image of shiny, pearly gates, streets of gold, as Doug is saying here. So, an image of just almost a Hollywoodish kind of feel to it, something that's nothing like what we experience regularly or daily. Sam says that it's a place where there's no more suffering. Okay, yeah. Kathy says, many rooms in my Father's house. There's that reading from, I think it's the 14th chapter of John, which is one of the places where we believe Jesus was pointing our attention to heaven. Karen says, meeting up with loved ones who've gone before us. So a reunion of sorts of those that we love and who've loved us. Kay says that it's a feast is set, that a table, a heavenly banquet, sometimes it's referred to. So there'll be some good eating up there. We Methodists like that. Catherine says, love and peace and God and no more tears. All those joyful, beautiful concepts and experiences that we long for, Catherine says, is a part of whatever heaven is like. Drew says we refer to heaven with qualities that fulfill what we're missing now. So that's an interesting concept to think about, that when we describe heaven, when we think of heaven, when we long for heaven, what's happening is, Drew says, it's often involves that which eludes us, is beyond our grasp, if you will, here in this world and in this life. So interesting to think about. Sandy says harps and clouds and angels with wings, of course, right? Yeah. Dave says St. Peter at the gatekeeper. There's a lot of jokes about St. Peter at the gates of heaven. So I think that's one of the common ways of thinking and talking about it. Sam says again, my Father's house, that there's a place where we live, that, a room is made ready, Jesus said, kind of like our special place. Tom says that there's lots of harps again, a harp choir, or choirs. Hey, yeah, choirs of angels, songs of angels, yeah. Harry says that we're free from all suffering. Again, that idea of that joy that follows. And then Janine says it's very unrealistic, but idyllic settings. So I think when you say very unrealistic, what you mean, I think, Janine, is that we image heaven as so opposite from here, so different from, so other than what we know and experience here in this world and life. So, yeah. And Matt says everyone is dressed in white robes. Yeah. I don't think in heaven you have to worry about what you're going to wear. It's already taken care of. And white seems to be the color of choice, right? Purity, healing, clean, pure, all of those kind of thoughts kind of go along with how we think so often heaven is. So one of the things that, I want to just say about all this as we move toward the video here tonight is, first of all, this is not about looking at all of that, thinking about all of that, and passing judgment on that to say, that's totally misses the mark. I think what we're wanting to say together, and let's do it as graciously as we know how, and with as much openness as we know how. What we want to say is that to only think of heaven in those kinds of terms, to only go with the language and the imagery and the assumptions that have always been a part of kind of the tradition of our faith in our growing up, and to just stay with that, is, at least in N.T. Wright's opinion, to miss out on not only what is deeper, but in many ways, what is truer about the reality of heaven. And the reason that I can say that, and I feel with some confidence as I affirm what N.T. Wright is wanting us to embrace, is that along with him, I believe it's biblical. That the Bible doesn't really want us to stay with these kinds of thoughts and images about heaven. But that there's something deeper, there's something truer, there's something more beautiful even, there's something certainly more powerful, and something that holds a capacity to impact us at a level where life flows, And so part of the invitation that I've felt, and as I've shared in these sessions with you, and I'm hoping that you can join me in this, is to discover something else, something that's kind of wider and deeper than I had previously held on to about these matters. And as I do that, wow, something happens, something opens up. There's a possibility there that wasn't there before. So I think that's part of the beauty of all of this. All right. Well, let me pause there. Let me turn to the video. And as you're watching the video, you want to listen for some things, of course. I think you're going to enjoy this one particularly. Notice or listen for the ways in which N.T. Wright puts out there the ways that, again, we often think of heaven, and then what he goes on to say in such a way much better than I ever could about both what the Bible actually says about it and who and where Jesus is in all of that, and how that kind of challenges some of what we maybe have always assumed to be true, about heaven, but even more importantly, invites us to move forward or into some new territory and to discover some new things. So, with all of that, let's turn to the video. It's a little longer, I think, than the last couple of weeks. So sit back, make sure your volume's where you need it to be, grab an ice water, iced tea, whatever it is, and enjoy it. Listen, and we'll come back and do some more conversation. Okay? Here it is. NT Wright.
Here in England, we have so much weather it hurts sometimes. And on a day like today, suddenly the clouds roll in and there they are, all fluffy and pretty. And some people, when they look up at those clouds here, or indeed in America or elsewhere, they have been taught to think, maybe that's what heaven's like. We know we'll go up there to be with God and the angels, and we'll be sitting on those clouds and maybe playing harps and wearing long robes and all that stuff. And I've even heard people who talk like that quite seriously, as though they really do think that to get to heaven, you somehow have to go flying up in the sky and land up on one of those things. Now, we all know, in fact, that clouds wouldn't sustain you even if you tried to sit on them, but that doesn't stop people talking as if that's where we were going to be. There is one obvious problem about that. Came out in a Far Side cartoon a few years ago. There was a guy sitting on one of these clouds with a harp, and he was saying, I wish I'd brought a magazine. He was bored, because that idea of just sitting around on a cloud all day forever and ever and ever, like, why would you want to do that? So we got this problem. There are some people who really do think that that's what life after death and salvation is going to be like, and there are other people who say, if that's what it's like, it's not as much fun as it was cracked up to be. The good news is that the biblical view of salvation, of life after death, isn't like either of those. It's much more interesting and, what's more, much more hopeful. There's a great deal of talk about heaven in popular Christian circles, but also, of course, quite a bit in the Bible itself. But very few people, in my experience, stop to ask, what actually is heaven? Where is it? What sort of a place or a space actually are we talking about here? I have met people who really seriously believe that heaven is a place, an area within our space-time universe, so that if only you could go up far enough, you would eventually get there. Quite what that says about people who live the other side of the world. Do they have to go down? And is it down there as well? I'm really not sure. But most people realize that it's actually not like that. There was once a Russian astronaut who went out into space and came back and declared that he'd been out there and looked for God, and there couldn't be a God because he hadn't seen him. He said he'd been out there, no God, no heaven, no nothing. Quite a lot of people, hearing that, thought probably just as well, actually, because that wasn't the sort of thing that heaven or God was supposed to be anyway. So what is heaven? Where is it? A lot of people still, though they think it isn't a physical place, imagine that heaven is a long way away. They think of earth and heaven as strange, different sorts of realities, but separated by a great gulf, so that you couldn't actually imagine them coming together. And therefore, if they think of someone, whether it's God or a human being, in heaven, they imagine that God or that human being is a long way away, can't really be in contact with us, must have really nothing much to do with us at all. But in the Bible, it's not like that. In the Bible, heaven and earth are the two interlocking spheres of God's good creation. It's as though God makes heaven and earth, and right from the beginning in the book of Genesis, it appears that they overlap, that they're supposed to work together somehow, in a mysterious way, of course, so that God can show up and then go away again, not to a great distance, but so that he is known and then not known, and people have a sense of his presence and then a sense perhaps of his absence, and then a sense of at least his possibility. Heaven and earth somehow merging and mingling, but in such a way that we can never actually control that, though we can experience it and we can learn to respond appropriately to it. So that's one of the first things to say about heaven in the Bible, right there from the book of Genesis, that God created heaven and earth, and it looks as though they're supposed to belong together. And you can cut from that straight across to one of the most wonderful things that St. Paul says in one of his greatest letters, the letter to the Ephesians, when in chapter 1, verse 10, he says that God's plan always was to sum up in Christ everything in heaven and on earth. Again, we have that sense of heaven as being God's space, but designed to work together with earth, which is our space. And of course, that fits very well with the picture at the end of the book of Revelation, where, as we saw in an earlier session, we have heaven coming down to earth. But it's not just that heaven and earth are supposed to overlap. One of the great truths which we find in Scripture again and again is that heaven is, as it were, the control room for what happens on earth. There are some wonderful passages in the Old Testament which make this quite clear, particularly when the Jewish people in the Old Testament are faced with the might of pagan empire. When you get in the book of Daniel and his friends facing some of the greatest kings and kingdoms of the pagan world of their day, what they end up saying to those kings and their kingdoms is, listen, there is a God in heaven, and that God is actually sovereign over earth, and you, who claim to run this earth, had therefore better watch out, because the God who is in heaven is in fact calling you to account. Now, of course, that's one of the reasons why people think that heaven must be a long way away from earth, because they say, if heaven is the control room for earth, doesn't seem to be doing a great job of things right now. Earth is still in a pretty awful mess. But again and again, the stories we find in the Bible are stories about the God who lives in heaven, which is not far away at all, just as it were, round the corner, as close to us almost as breath, it sometimes seems. The God who lives in heaven wanting actually to make his sovereign rule known on earth, but knowing perfectly well that if he does it instantly and immediately, it will have some pretty devastating effects, and so bringing that sovereign rule to bear through the work of his Spirit, of his Son, of his powerful love, the message of his hope and his love coming from heaven to earth to transform earth in a way which will heal it and not simply burn it up, as it were. So what happens when we think of heaven as the control room for earth? How is that going to play out? We find in the Gospels Jesus as the place where heaven and earth meet. To understand this properly, you have to understand a bit about what the ancient Jews thought about the temple. When we think about the temple in Jerusalem, we may imagine that it was, as it were, just like a big church on a street corner. And you'd go there to worship, and you'd go there to say your prayers, and you maybe go there for special festivals, but that would be about the long and the short of it. For the Jews, it was much, much more than that. For the Jewish people, it was as though the temple was the place where heaven and earth really did overlap, so that when they went into the temple, it wasn't just, let's pretend that we're in heaven. It was actually, when we're in this building on earth, we are actually also in heaven. Actually, some church architects in the Christian world have tried to do something similar. In the Eastern Orthodox churches, they have the bit at one end which symbolizes heaven and the bit at the other end which symbolizes earth, and you have pictures on the screen in between of the saints so that the people who are, as it were, in earth can see what it might be going on actually in heaven. And then the gospel book is brought out because that's a reality which comes from heaven to earth, and the sacraments are brought out because they come from heaven to earth. And so the whole of the church building is designed to say, listen, when we're worshipping, we can be in heaven and on earth at the same time, anticipating the great reality when God is going to bring the two of them together at last. So what does that then tell us about what many people couple with heaven, not earth, but actually hell? I think a lot of language got off on the wrong foot somewhere in the Middle Ages when people, and you can see it in Michelangelo's great painting in the Sistine Chapel, people started envisaging heaven and hell as it were, equal and opposite realities. So that from roughly the 12th or the 13th century onwards in Western culture, both Catholics and Protestants tended to say, well, you go through your life and the aim is either to get to heaven or to go to hell. And you've got to choose wisely in this life, and then hopefully you'll get to heaven rather than hell. But in the Bible, heaven is not equal and opposite with hell. Heaven, as I've said, is designed to come together with earth, and the word hell, in the way we use it, is a rather loose and actually not always very helpful way of holding out that awful possibility that because God has given us responsibility as human beings, we have the right, if we so choose, to say to him, we do not wish to be part of this new heaven plus earth reality. We just want to stay in our own world, a world which we can control, a world which we can make. We want to keep heaven out of the picture. And because we have the dignity of being human beings, God has given us the right to do that. And that is a tragic possibility, which, according to the New Testament, many do in fact embrace. But it needn't be like that. And to try to use that awful possibility as a way of frightening people into saying, well, you better avoid hell, so look, here's how you get into heaven, often can appeal to exactly the wrong instincts, a kind of selfish self-preservation instinct, rather than the thing which makes the gospel what it is, which is the promise that God is going to make the whole world over anew, and has invited us to share in that making new right here and now in our own lives, but also to share in the work of what he's going to do to bring it all about. So we shouldn't then think of heaven and hell as places within our cosmos. One may be a long way up in the sky and another one way down there on earth. They are rather states of existence. But they are states of existence which are not the same sort of thing at all, because in the life of heaven, when it is joined to earth, we become more truly human. And the point about hell, sadly, is that is where people become less truly human, because you become like what you worship. And if you worship the God in whose image you are made, you become more genuinely human. And if you refuse to worship him, if you hold him at arm's length, if you say, no, I don't want to have anything to do with you, or to have you having anything to do with me and my life, then you are, as it were, colluding with the dangerous possibility of becoming less and less genuinely human altogether. That is a tragic possibility, and we have to be aware of that for all of us, even though the Bible has great promises about how, in fact, we can be part of God's new heavens and new earth. People often get puzzled when they read the New Testament, particularly for the first time, when in Matthew's Gospel Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven, but in Mark and Luke and a little bit in John he talks about the kingdom of God. Actually, for many Jews, those were two ways of saying the same thing. And because they were often reverent about not wanting to say the word God too often, they sometimes would say heaven when they meant God. The trouble is that many Christians reading Matthew's Gospel particularly find Jesus saying things like, if you do this, if you do that, you will be called either the least or the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. And because many Christians assume that the name of the game is to go to heaven, they think that Jesus is talking about a kingdom, namely a place called heaven, where you might or might not go at the end of time or the end of your life. But Jesus himself makes it quite clear in some of the very same passages that that's not what's going on. In Matthew chapter 6, right in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, and it's as it were in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount, if you look at how that great sermon really works and is structured, Jesus teaches us to pray, "Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as in heaven." In other words, the kingdom of heaven is not a place called heaven where you go to escape from earth. The kingdom of heaven means the sovereign rule of heaven, which is coming to birth on earth. So why does Jesus say in Luke's Gospel to one of the brigands who was being crucified alongside him, "Today you will be with me in paradise"? Isn't that going away from earth and being somewhere else? Well, yes, it is. Paradise is actually an old word not used very often in the Bible, just from time to time, which literally means a beautiful garden, a lovely resting place. But the point about paradise is not that it's a place to go and live forever and ever. Paradise, or in that sense heaven, is a place where you go to be refreshed until the time comes when you can continue your journey to your destination. So the fact remains, when Jesus spoke about heaven, he was basically speaking about God's rule coming on earth, but obviously for people who die before that final event happens, they will be with him in heaven or in paradise until the work of the kingdom on earth is actually complete. So to sum up, heaven is God's space. It is where there is God's peace and justice ruling and reigning, and God's plan is to bring that together with the life of earth. He has made that real in Jesus, doing in Jesus what the temple in Jerusalem had already symbolized, bringing heaven and earth together. And then those who follow Jesus find that in the power of his Spirit, heaven and earth can start to come together where they are as well, in their lives and through their lives. So we shouldn't think of heaven as just some place where we might end up one day if we're lucky. We should think of it as the reality which can come to birth here and now. We will talk in a later session about what does happen after death for those who belong to Jesus, because it isn't just about going to heaven forever and ever. It's going to heaven, yes, but then something much more wonderful out beyond that. But that's another story. For now, let's just focus on this, that God's space and our space are meant to work together, and we can learn what that means right here and right now.
All right. Well, I hope you found the teaching from N.T. Wright tonight to be interesting at the least, and intriguing, and maybe even edifying. In other words, it builds us up. So good thoughts from him tonight, I thought, particularly. And how about the way he teases us there to say, later on in our study, he's going to help us think about what happens after we die, and even something greater than what we've ever imagined. So that'll be worth waiting for. You'll see the question that I posted there at the end of the video. What is missing for us when we see heaven only as a place that is, far away? And so Brenna's already responded there to get us started, which I appreciate. Let me just refer to her comment. She says, we miss experiencing heaven here on earth. We miss the interlocking relationship of heaven and earth. So if our sights are only set on what might be someday somewhere other than where I am, then what Brenna's saying is we miss the very thing that God is doing or intends to happen right here where we are. So that's important. Catherine says that we miss seeing what God's doing right here on earth, how that heaven is here on earth, that aspect of it. So it's a thought of missing out, of not seeing, of not being able to participate and react and be part of it when we're only thinking, where I might get to someday. Tim says to be refreshed here in this life, right here, right now. That's what we will miss if we only think of heaven as a future destination. Deacon Sandy says the transformation and experience of earth as heaven, God's space. So I think what you're saying there in response to the question then, Sandy, is that's what we miss. We miss the creative process, the transforming process, the newness of what God is doing, and how God is making that happen right now. And again, with only the thought that it's out there somewhere, then we're going to miss the possibility here. So let's just take that edge of it a little farther. If we embrace what NT is wanting us to think about, and as we're doing that, let me just catch Tom's comment. I think sometimes we're so focused on hell on earth that we miss seeing heaven on earth. Yeah. And I think it's a matter of perspective. It's a matter of, focus or lack of focus, however you want to think about it. So Tom, I think you're right. We're so wrapped up in what isn't, or what is wrong or negative or less than, that we miss the powerful reality that is right here with us. And Lee says faith without works is dead. So we should be focused on our neighbor. Yeah. So, we're here for a reason. I think N.T. Wright said earlier in one of the other sessions, when we think about resurrection and heaven as something that impacts us now, then we've got work to do. And I think somebody earlier on in our session tonight said, maybe it was Kathy and Amira said that, if this is all true, then we better get busy. There's a reality that's waiting for us to step into it. And, here we are talking about missing it simply because of where our focus is and where our assumptions are about what is true. So, for that reason, it really does begin to shift this thought, shifts our priority, not to what might happen someday if I'm lucky, but what's going on right now, today, with the people I'm with the reality that's surrounding me, with the opportunities that are presented, as well as the struggles that I'm in the midst of. What is the reality of heaven as it emerges right there, right in the midst of this? And, that potentially then can open us up to things that we've never thought possible before. It really creates, it seems to me, a living faith. And I think that maybe is partly what Lee is saying, that our faith is meant to be a faith in action. This isn't just a cerebral, only hold the thought in my mind about what might be true of it, but to live it out and to be engaged in what this means in the way I live, and particularly, I think, in relationships with other people. It's not just about our relationship with God. We're talking about this connection with others and about our place and our purpose in this world. I want to get your take on what was for me a new phrase that NT threw out there. I read it in the material, the book. It was a part of that opening quote that I shared. And then he mentioned it and hit it pretty hard in the video. So I wanted to get your take on this phrase. As I'm doing so, let me just catch a few more comments just for my own edification here, my own education. Dave says, focusing on heaven often leads to not caring about what happens on earth. Yeah, so there's that idea, and he speaks to that. He says, if you solidly are in the place where, our goal is to get out of here and get to wherever heaven is, then why care about here? Why care about others? Why care about the earth? Why care about the future? All of those aspects of what's true here become unimportant if your sight is only on some other place. Sandy says coming of heaven and earth is not only about relationships with people, which is partly what I was saying, but she says, oh, there it is. Creation, earth, a place to be honored, cared for, God working in and through us. So it's really saying there's no aspect of what we are given what we receive, what we have, what we enjoy, what we participate in, that is outside of the realm of this connection, as N.T. Wright is describing it, of heaven and earth coming together. So this leads me then to my next question, and I was referring to this phrase that was new to me. He said, think of heaven as the control room for earth. The control room for earth. Now, I have never thought of that phrase of words connected to heaven ever before. So I'm wondering, what your take is on that. Give us some kind of gut reaction to that. What's he trying to say? What do you think that means when he says that heaven is the control room of earth? Any gut reaction to that? Of course, there's no right or wrong answer. It's only what we think or what we can begin to kind of discover together that could be true about it. I've got a couple notes that I put down as, knowing I was going to lift that up for you to think about. Part of what I was thinking then in response as to what that might mean, it's a way of saying that God is in charge. And that means God's in charge, like here and now. So that matters, that should get our attention. Heaven is the control room of earth. In other words, the power and the authority for creation, but also me, you, rests in God. Liz is saying it reminds me of the old cartoon, God at his computer. Why? Like we all are right now, right? His finger is hovering over the smite button. I remember that. I can see that cartoon as well. Smite. The Old Testament language, God smote me, or smote the enemy, or whatever. So Brenda says, pulling us back to a little more serious, although Liz, thank you for that. The control room on earth makes it sound like it's close, like it's nearby, like there's a connection, I got controls here and they're within arm's reach, because something may go wrong and I need to be in touch. So partly what you're saying there, Brenda, is that image or that metaphor of heaven being the control room implies an immediacy, a connection between the two. I hadn't thought about it like that. I like it. Dave says, as I look around, it appears that the control room has lost control. And he says something about that in his book. He says, one of the critiques of this is, okay, if heaven's in control, then heaven's not doing a very good job right now. And he's got some things to say about that. That are interesting, and I think those will come out as we move along, if not tonight, in the evenings that are ahead. Sandy says, I don't think it means that God is controlling what happens. That would make us feel like puppets. Good kind of nuance to the thing. We don't want to say that we have no freedom in this, right? In fact, N.T. Wright says we have a lot of freedom. It's built into this whole process that as human beings, we're given the right to choose. So to say heaven's the control room doesn't mean that heaven's totally in control. That might be part of the response to Dave's thought there earlier. Julie says the parameters of how we should express our understanding of God and Jesus. So that, again, this deep connection, this very strong and immediate joining together of the purpose of God and our purpose, that's the context. So that our lives should be expressing then that kind of understanding of God. Brenda says, because the control room is where a person who is in charge says, make sure that everything works correctly. Or at least is aware of everything, monitoring everything, right? Kind of back to the problem with any metaphor, and I think it's here for this one, to imply that if heaven's in charge, then what's going on with all of this? Why are we in the midst of a pandemic then, right? Catherine says, God has a plan, and we better start getting it right, she says. So again, wake up, right? And the Bible says that often. Be alert, be aware. It's time. God's doing something. You want to be a part of it. You don't want to miss it. Don't be asleep. Be awake. Here it comes. Yeah. And then Barbara says, we're being lovingly watched over. So there's the other aspect of it. There's that care, that ever-present, watchful, loving eye of God. If you're any of us who are parents or grandparents, you know what it's like when you have small children. You're always aware, and that's one of the reasons why it's so tiring sometimes when you're caring for little ones, because you can never just relax and say, oh, well, they'll be fine. No, because you're always vigilant about where they are, what they're doing, everything's okay. And Barbara's saying there's some nature of that in the way that God is connected to us as we think about heaven and earth coming together. Now, we're just about done, but I want to just at least mention what I thought was a significant part of the video experience tonight when he talks about hell and heaven. Just to encapsulate that, summarize some of it. He was saying that, again, one of the assumptions we have is that hell and heaven are sort of mutual, or not mutual, but equal opposites is what I'm trying to say. And so, the idea is that, and let me just catch Tom. Tom says that part of it wasn't so helpful, that metaphor. His eye is on the sparrow. I know he watches me, but not controls me. So appreciate that nuance. I think that language of control does have potentially some, trouble for us if we're not careful. So I'm with you in that, and I appreciate the insight around that. And then Kay says, actually a great analogy, because even though we watch, we aren't always in control as parents and child. Oh, the analogy of being a parent. Yeah, we're not in control of the kid. We don't manipulate them, but we lovingly watch over. And I think, again, that's more what Tom was saying, seems to be more helpful than like the wizard behind the curtain, moving the levers and everything. And that's not the image of God that N.T. Wright has either. So I was just saying his talk about hell and heaven, and he says we think of them as like mutually opposite, or that's not the right phrase. What I was saying, equally opposite. So, but equal in power and influence and presence and all of that. And N.T. Wright's calling that into question. He's saying no. We think of it like when we go through life and then we got to pick either this way or that way. And, the path is shaped evenly, and we better choose correctly. And he says, no, heaven and earth come together. Hell, he says, is a denial of that. So it's the absence. Hell is the absence, in the way he's thinking, of an experience where God's purpose and God's presence is infused within our experience, our life, and therefore then guides, shapes, and creates our purpose and the meaning for our existence. Hell is the denial of that. When we have that, what he's saying is we're more and more created, or become who we are created to be, human beings in relationship with God. Denying it makes us less and less what God has created us to be. So we're less human, and we are giving then ourselves over to that which is not primarily God's desire for us from the beginning. So I thought that there's a lot of deeper stuff in all of that, but I didn't want to leave tonight without at least noting that. And some of that may come back as we move forward. Well, just notice in our time, we're just about at the hour mark. It goes fast. I so appreciate all of the wonderful comments, and there's a couple there at the end, Sam saying God's in charge. We were trying to just sense together, what does that mean? And I think one of the things we don't want to let go of as we talk about that is the loving and life-giving nature of God from the beginning. So, that doesn't change. So however God is connected, is involved, is shaping us and our world, it comes out of what is there from the beginning, which is a God who brings light to darkness and grace to that which is broken, healing to that which is wounded, and all of those life-giving aspects that we know to be true. And then, of course, what he said is that Jesus is the place where all of that happens. The life of Jesus is that coming together of heaven and earth. I thought that was a rather beautiful way of thinking about Christ, and maybe a good way to kind of finish out. Sandy says here at the end, she likes the way NT talks about us being more human when we choose God and less human when we focus on idols or even only on ourselves. So I appreciated that too. All right, friends. Well, we could keep going. These are deep matters, but we've got more sessions. We're only halfway through. We've got 3 down, but we've got 3 to go. And appreciate your participation. We're going to keep it going. Look for the link. I know I sent one late this week, so I sent it yesterday. I didn't send it again today. So if you think you don't have it and you need it, you can either reach out to me, or you can go to the church website, and right on the front page of the website there's a little icon that you can click for the study, and it'll take you right to the link that'll hook you in. So that's a default way to find the link if you think either I'm slow or I've left you out somehow. So, which is never my intent, that's for sure. All right, friends. Well, we're going to sign off. I know you want to say good night and goodbye to one another, so take a few minutes to do that. I'll leave the chat roll for a couple of minutes, and just have a great evening and a great rest of the week. Worship with us at 10 on Sunday morning, and connect in all the other ways that we're making possible, okay? As Katya says, check out our YouTube channel. Thanks for the commercial, Katya. All right, everybody. Take care.